In this video, we will be talking about the occupational distribution of the Indian population at the eve of independence. And at the end of the video, you should have a clear understanding of just how dependent India was on the agricultural sector. However, before we look at that, I want to take a step back and talk about the occupational distribution in general. Although the textbook breaks down the economy into three sectors of employment, the primary, secondary, and tertiary, in reality, there is a fourth sector named the quaternary. The primary sector is engaged in agriculture, fishing, forestry, animal husbandry. Basically, this sector is comprised primarily of jobs that require little formal education or little to low levels of literacy. The secondary sector employs industries which are involved in the production of a product. The tertiary sector involves firms which are involved in providing services, and the quaternary sector, which is known as the knowledge-based sector, involves IT and education. For the purpose of this course, we're going to ignore the quaternary sector completely, as the textbook doesn't mention it whatsoever. If we take a close look at the breakdown of the occupational structure at the time of independence, we can clearly see that the primary sector was responsible for about 70% of employment. The secondary sector was responsible for roughly 10%, and the tertiary sector was responsible for roughly 20%. Now, let's take a little bit of a closer look at each of these sectors in a little bit more detail. The primary sector, which was responsible for 72.9% of employment, is staggeringly high when compared to just 2% for the UK and US, 4% for Germany, and although the textbook mentioned Japan's rate as being 12%, as of 2010, it is now 3.8%. Moving on to the second topic, industry, 9% of Indians were engaged in such endeavors at the eve of independence, but this paled in comparison to 42% for the UK, 39% for Japan, and 32% for the United States. This data is important because it proves that the Indian economy was indeed in a backward state at the eve of independence, as jobs in manufacturing were still few and far between. Finally, in this section, let's take a look at unbalanced growth. Simply said, when each of the sectors makes up 33.3% of employment, then the economy is said to be balanced. As we can clearly see by the statistics provided in the table in this section, the Indian economy is far from balanced. The textbook mentions that there was some regional variation in this distribution, which means that in some regions in India, the primary sector may have accounted for a higher or lower percentage, but overall, generally speaking, the economy was unbalanced as a whole, with the primary sector accounting for the vast majority of employment. So, after reading through this section, what have we learned? Well, the Indian economy at the eve of independence was extremely dependent on agriculture, absolutely unbalanced, and few opportunities for employment in the secondary market were present. Moreover, since we know that the state of the agricultural sector was in chaos, as learnt from section 1 of this chapter, we can clearly say that more than 70% of Indians lived in impoverished conditions under British rule. To explain that in easier to understand terms, more than 70% of Indians were basically employed in slave labor under British rule.